Chapter 4. The emigrants decided that they could more fully protect themselves against Indians if they all traveled together. But these men were not frontiersmen. They were not mountain or desert men. Most of them were farmers from the Middle West, and the others were just as green in this kind of life. Only Bill Eddy, among them all, had intuitions that guided a man when facing frontier problems. He knew that guards should be posted throughout the night, but his cattle were all gone, and he had nothing more to lose. Even Mrs. Reed's borrowed wagon was drawn by a borrowed team. Those richest in livestock now were the Breen, Graves, and Donner families. The Donners Bill liked, and he warned them, but Jake was old and sick, and George behaved like one who was hopelessly confused. The next day they did post a guard, but the man fell asleep, and just before daylight the Indians swooped down again and ran off 18 oxen and a milk cow. These beasts belonged chiefly to the Donners and Wolfingers. No attempt was made at all to recover them, as if such losses were punishments from God and not to be disputed. The bewildered emigrants hastily yoked their teams and pushed on, hoping soon to leave these cowardly thieving Indians behind. This night they camped close by a swamp covered with dry, tough grass, and into this swamp they drove their beasts to graze. That shrewd Irishman, Pat Breen, now had by far the largest herd of cattle, and he went out to keep an eye on his beasts. A little later he came shouting back to the camp. The first man he came to was Bill Eddy. "Help!" cried Pat. "My mare, she's took. It's a wonder if'n she don't mire plumb out of sight." He grasped Bill's arm to lead him, but Eddy shook the hand off. "To hell with your mare. I hope she sinks clear to China." "Bill, help me. I know we can drag her out, if'n we hurry." Bill pointed to the desert behind them. "Back there, Pat. An old man is dead. The coyotes are eating him now. Did you care about him when I asked for a horse? By God, no, you didn't. You wouldn't save a man, and now you ask me to save a horse. I'll tell you, Pat, if I went with you, I'd just jump on your mare and push her under." Pat's eyes had been full of entreaty, but now they were crafty and hard. It was not that this Irishman had an ungenerous heart. Peggy was boss. In this mother was a resolve to see her 8 children through alive, even if she had to die for them. The same resolve had taken unalterable form in every mother here, and the more uncertain and dark the outlook became, the more completely was all purpose in them stripped to a single and calculating devotion. In the dominant ones, like Peggy and Mrs. Graves, mother love had already withdrawn behind a front that seemed ruthlessly selfish. If they felt any compassion for children other than their own, they didn't show it. Lavina Murphy drew no sharp line between her children and those of another, and gave to all who came within her reach the same care. Tamsen Donner also did so. The less assertive ones, like Harriet McCutcheon and Eleanor Eddy, were no less determined to save their children. But neither of them had the heart to say no if someone asked for food. No man here was observant enough to perceive that every mother among them was becoming, in her own way, a desperate she-beast in defense of her young, ready to sacrifice herself or anything that stood in the way of her purpose. If Bill had known all this, he wouldn't have spoken so sharply to Pat Breen. He would have realized that Peggy had already faced, as some of them had not, the perils ahead of her, and wouldn't risk the life of a child to save an old man from Belgium. The men didn't know this, and could hardly have understood it if they had known. Bill Eddy was one who, for his wife and babies, would have fought anything under heaven, but his vision of the future was obscured by a generous and impulsive heart. He would give away what he had, even when his own family was starving, as indeed he did a few days later. The train was now pushing toward the sink. The day after Breen's mare sank out of sight, 3 beasts, too weak to move, were left by the roadside. During this night, the livestock grazed on the guard at some distance from camp. When the guards came in for breakfast, the watchful and waiting Digger Indians struck again. They slipped up and shot arrows into 21 head. Their bows were too weak to drive the arrows deep, but the sly thieves knew that some of the animals would be left behind. The Indians could come in later for the kill. When it was learned that the Indians were shooting arrows, every man in camp rushed out to drive the beasts home. They came with arrows stuck in shoulders and flanks. The men corralled them with a ring of people, and then strove to cut out the arrows that were not deeply embedded. The wounds they sopped with oil. 7 head were mortally wounded, and these they shot. They cut the beasts open and removed a few steaks. Nobody was far-sighted enough to suggest that they ought to jerk all the beef and take it with them. Though waiting for Stanton and Mac to return with beef and flour, they left their own dead cattle and frantically pushed on. Both Wolfinger and Eddie now had to abandon their wagons. For the latter, this meant only the removing of bedding and a little food that belonged to him and the Reeds. But Wolfinger's wagon was still piled high with goods. This wealthy man had brought some fine silverware and bolts of cloth, a part of which he had expected to sell in California. Now he had to leave it all behind. He would remain, he said, and dig a deep hole, make a box of his wagon boards, and bury the cash. 2 sly Germans, Reinhardt and Spitzer, watched him unload the goods, and presently they offered to stay behind and help him. Augustus Spitzer was a tall, blond young man who was disproportionately long in his legs and arms. He had a long, thin face in which the eyes were the most compelling feature. It was not their size or shape, it was their color. Some might have thought they were gray, some blue, but none could have been sure, because they never rested on you for more than a fleeting moment. Like the eyes of a monkey, they were restless and seemed constantly to be searching for what they could never find. Spitzer himself was that way. Always, except when asleep, he moved about, his short torso going in enormous strides as if on stilts. Reinhardt, his constant companion, was also a little chilling in his appearance. He was much shorter and rather a dog for a German, and his legs were too short for his frame. Aside from these differences, he might have been taken for Spitzer's brother. He was a crafty fellow, too, but he smiled a great deal, though his smile, without spontaneity, seemed to be little more than a deliberate distortion of his face. His small eyes were an ale brown, flecked with green. Sometimes when they looked at you, they seemed to be, for a moment at least, very open and frank, but almost at once the loose skin of his face would grin from chin to brow, and then in the eyes you saw the swift flickering of the man's thoughts. It was as if he offered a hand in greeting, and you grasped it and closed on a knife. These were the 2 men who said they would help Wolfinger, and Wolfinger was grateful for the help. He was weak from walking and short rations, and to dig a deep hole in hard, dry earth would have taken him a long while. When the others heard that these 2 men were going to stay with Wolfinger, the thoughts in their minds were by no means the same. Mrs. Murphy, for whom all human beings were kindly and good, told her children that Spitzer and Reinhardt were fine young men, but Lem Murphy, a plucky lad of 12, spoke up quickly. "'Tain't so, Ma. They ain't up to no good." That was the thought Damson Donner had. That was the thought Bill Eddy expressed to his wife. "Those lazy sons of dogs have loafed this whole trip, and now they're going to help dig a hole. I can smell 2 rats in it." "Honey," said Eleanor reproachfully, "you're always judging people and then changing your mind." "That's true," Bill admitted. "But why would those men stay behind and risk their lives? They're all Germans. Maybe that's why." "Well, we'll see." Bill put bedding and food in Tamsen's wagon, together with the smallest Reed children and his own too, and then he and his wife and Mrs. Reed and her daughters walked behind the train. With them was Mrs. Wolfinger, this tall, haughty woman who had outraged all of them by wearing jewels and silks, trudged along hour after hour in her own loneliness. Nobody seemed to know her first name. Nobody understood why this wealthy couple, fresh from Germany, had headed west. But she had, Bill perceived, a fine, proud spirit in her. Her shoes were cut to ribbons, and her feet were bleeding. But never once during this long, dreary day did she flinch or show sign of pain. Like the others, she was dying of thirst. The resourceful Peggy Breen had several casks for water, and they were never empty. But most of the emigrants had lost or abandoned their water vessels, and had had none to begin with. At the sink they had drunk all the foul water they could stomach, and now depended on grit to carry them through. Before them lay the desert between the sink and the Truckee River. How wide it was none of them knew, and no guidebook in their possession told them. Fearing the worst, and remembering the mirages of thirst on the salt flats, they pushed desperately on. The 14 wagons stringing out across a couple of miles, and each family fighting for itself alone. Far into the night they journeyed, then slept for a few hours and moved again. The Donner beasts were now falling in their yokes, without waiting to be asked, for perhaps Tamsen would never have asked it. Eddie took his babies from the wagon. He carried Jimmy, age 3, and Eleanor carried the infant. For 24 hours this family had eaten nothing but a little sugar. The second day in the waterless desert was one of terrible heat and dust and thirst. From time to time Bill looked at his wife, watching her face for signs of exhaustion. They were alone now. Mrs. Wolfinger and Margaret Reed and her children were ahead somewhere. A mile behind the train, and then 2 and 3 and 4 were the Eddies, without a drop of anything to drink. Bill Eddy had the strength of a giant. He had, as events were to show, more endurance than any other man here, and his wife was no weakling, though now she was traveling on nerve. With one child riding his right arm and the other his left, he trudged mile after mile, with Eleanor gallantly at his side. No suffering seemed to have the power to break this man to weakness. If life had sent him west alone, he might have been another Daniel Boone or Jed Smith. His feet were bleeding. The dust was so thick in his throat that he could barely talk. But he talked. "They say Truckee's a nice cold stream. Honey, when we get there, we'll drink till our bellies bust." Eleanor was unable to speak, but she smiled and squeezed his arm. When noon came, with the sun looking as if it had been disintegrated into a cumulus of heat, Bill sat for a moment to rest. He looked at his wife. She was beautiful, he reflected, even when sick and starved and covered with dust. "A bath, honey. Think how the cold water is going to feel." "Yes," she whispered. Her lips were rimmed with dust, and dust was like paste in her mouth and throat. Bill set the children on the earth and dug into a pocket. He gave each a lump of sugar to keep their throats moist. He offered Eleanor a lump, but she shook her head, and then he drew her to his arms and put a hand under her chin to tilt her head and looked into her eyes. They were inflamed by dust and wind, but there was no hint of weakness in them. "Brave wife," he said. There was something in his voice that made her tremble. She raised her dry lips, and Bill kissed her. "I love you," Bill said. "I love you," she whispered. Suddenly Bill turned, knowing that this would never do, and looked at their children. They were dusty little things. The older one was gravely sucking his sugar. Dusk came, the unreal grayness of desert twilight, and still they trudged on. With short intervals of rest, they walked all night under a cold, full moon. For 19 hours without food and water, covering more than 20 miles. And for all that distance, Eddie carried the 2 children. Again and again, he looked in his wife's eyes for sign of faltering, but he saw none. "I'm all right," she would whisper. It was breaking day when they came to the camp. Bill threw a blanket down, laid his wife and children on it, and went to find water. The train had camped by a hot spring. The water came out almost boiling and had to be cooled. It was vile and bitter to the taste. Bill borrowed a pail and cooled a gallon of water in the pail and carried it to his family. They all drank deeply of it. Even the baby drank with no more than a surprised winking of its eyes. "They're going on soon," Bill said. "Tamsin is throwing away most of her books. They're all throwing stuff away here." After a long moment he added, "Can we make it?" "We have to. That's a darling wife," he said, and looked up to see Tamsin Donner. "I brought you a little coffee," she said. "I wish—" "I know," said Bill quickly. "The coffee's enough. We'll make it." He laid a fire and boiled the coffee in the pail, but he refused to touch a drop. "I don't need it," he said, watching the children freshen as they drank. He urged Eleanor to drink a lot of it and to mix with it several lumps of sugar. This day, he said, would be the worst. Then they would reach the river. How his family lived through this day, Bill could never understand when looking back on it. Others, if they had thought of it, would have been amazed by the endurance of this man and his woman. For weeks they had starved. For 36 hours they had eaten only a little sugar. They had walked through a day and most of a night, and now, without sleep, they rose to walk again. If Bill hadn't been so fiercely independent, he would have asked someone to carry his children in a wagon. Rather than that, he set Jimmy astride his neck, with his child's hands clutching his hair, and then he took the babe in his arms, and with Eleanor at his side he set off. To avoid the dust turned up by wheels, he let the wagons leave them behind, and so again the 4 were alone in the desert. If they fell by the way, Bill knew that nobody would return for them. Nobody would dare. Throughout this train, it was everybody for himself now. Then Bill remembered that 3 Germans were behind them. If Eleanor failed, perhaps these men would come along and give him some help. This thought was with him as they plodded across the miles. But he didn't lean on it. He kept an eye on his wife, telling himself that he must not let her fail. It was late forenoon before they paused to rest. He set the children down, and Eleanor looked at them. In a whisper that was not at all excited, she said, "Honey, look, Jimmy." Eddie looked at his son, and it was clear to him at once that the child was dying of thirst. Jimmy's eyes were closed, his parched lips were wide apart, and he was breathing hard. He had sagged forward, with his legs sprawled to brace him. Bill rose. "Breen has some water," he said. "We must overtake him." Eleanor was so weak that he helped her to rise. "Shall I go on and let you wait here?" "No." She tried to smile, but her face felt as if it were set in heavy clay. "I'm strong," she whispered. "Let's go." They went on, walking a little more rapidly, and Eleanor marveled at the unused strength which seemed to be stored in every human frame. She felt sick with physical weakness, but it was the pain of hunger that distressed her most. It had left her stomach and now was as sharp as needles in her whole body. The act of walking seemed to release and scatter it, and she could never tell from moment to moment where the pains would strike next. They were a swarm of stings in her arms and legs, or they gathered in burning torture in her belly. Bill, too, she reflected, must be feeling such pain. He was strong, but his strength had its limits. How, without food or sleep, he could carry 2 children over such long distances was a wonder to her. As with her, she knew, it was threat of death and the sight of far mountains that kept him going. When the pains were not goading her, she felt drugged with sleep and seemed to move under a will that was not her own. It would have been so easy, she told herself, for all of them to sit by the road now and die. A little after noon, they came within sight of the rear wagon, though for some time they had seen its cloud of dust. They pushed on, trying desperately to increase their pace. The wagon was barely crawling, but it seemed to Eleanor that they would never overtake it. It seemed to her that they were almost running, but that was only because she was walking now as if drunk, with the landscape around her becoming more and more unreal. They came to the Donner wagons and went around them and on, and when they passed, they didn't speak and nobody spoke to them. They overtook and passed 2 more wagons, and then ahead of them, Bill saw the outfit of Pat Breen. "Honey, there it is." For more than an hour, they hadn't paused to look at the faces of their children. In Bill's arms, they both felt lifeless. Their heads sagged to their breasts, and he wasn't sure that either of them was conscious. He didn't stop to see. He pushed ahead until he came abreast, and then yelled, "Whoa!" to Breen's oxen. All of the Breens except the 2 smallest children were walking. When the beast stopped, Pat and his wife, like 2 wary creatures of dust, turned to Bill. "Pat, my children are dying. I want some water." It was Peggy who answered. Her voice was shrill. "You can't have none." "Look," said Bill. He set Jimmy on the earth, and the child toppled over. He held the baby up for them to see. It looked like a dead child. "By God, I tell you they're dying. I want some water for them, not for me." Peggy was sullen. She said he could have none. She said they didn't have enough for themselves. The wagons behind had stopped, but nobody came up to learn what the trouble was. The persons there, like the beasts, sagged and waited. Jimmy had toppled face downward in the dust, and Eleanor now knelt to hold him upright. Bill's temper exploded. "Breen, I intend to have some water. I don't want any trouble, but if you try and stop me, I'll kill you." Bill advanced to the wagon, and Pat Breen stepped back. Peggy moved to stop him. He hurled her aside, and she staggered and sank to her haunches. She sat there and looked up and cursed him, but Bill didn't hear. He entered the wagon, and when he came out he had a cask of water in his hands. Walking with their parents were 5 Breen children, ranging in years from 7 to 14. These children now stood back with hot, dry throats and watched. Bill had given the baby to Eleanor before entering the wagon. He now knelt and held the cask to Jimmy and poured water down his throat. When Peggy saw a little of the water spill, she cried out like a wild woman and staggered to her feet. "All right," Bill roared. "Bring me a cup." Hastily, Peggy dug into the wagon and found a cup and brought it to him. Standing above him like an avenger, she said God would punish him. Bill said nothing. He gave a full cup to Jimmy, who now sat with his legs spread and looked up at them. After Jimmy had drunk, Bill poured a cupful for the baby and handed the cask to Pat. "There," he said, "and thanks." The Eddies moved back from the road. The Breen children had been looking hopefully at the cask, but the thrifty Peggy stored it away. Then the wagons moved on in their clouds of dust. When Tamsin passed the Eddies, she smiled, and Margaret Reed, trudging by her side, said, "Don't give up. It can't be far to the river now." It was only a few miles, but all afternoon and until long after midnight the Eddies moved on alone. Bill put a lump of sugar in the mouths of the children and forced a third lump on his wife, but he would take none. He felt as strong as an ox, he said. But Eleanor looked at him and saw a pallor on his face that was not desert dust. Revived and refreshed, the children remained awake during the afternoon, and then came the cool, enveloping dusk of evening. "We're safe now," Bill said, and they paused for a long rest. Then they rose and pushed on, and again it was almost daylight when they entered the camp. Bill now perceived that only sheer grit had supported his wife during the last miles. When she saw grass and the cold flowing river, she fainted and fell, and when he dropped to her side, Bill thought for a moment she was dead. Setting the children down, he carried her to the river and bathed her face. With cupped palms, he held water to her mouth, and she drank. Then, after fetching the children to her and giving them water, he sat with his bleeding feet in the stream. Eleanor unfastened the blankets from his waist and spread them in the grass and lay on them with the children. But she didn't fall asleep at once. Her face, washed of its dust, was deathly white, but in her eyes was the same clear courage that Bill had always seen there. "It'll soon be daylight," he said. "I wonder if anyone would give us a little food."